Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. This is the fourth webinar as part of BredaPhoto's expansive digital program for BredaPhoto Festival 2020. Sometimes I think we were tempting fate by assigning the theme of the best of times, the worst of times. And I feel, given that it's 2020, that the worst of times won by a landslide. So here we are. So we have an amazing 90 minutes ahead of us. And before I introduce my guests, I'm going to share two very short 3-minute pitches by young photography talent. BredaPhoto has always invested a lot of time and resources to develop young photography talent in this particular program. The festival invites young photographers from universities 2 years after they've graduated and not exceeding 5 years from universities and institutes all over Europe to pitch their project, and 3 out of 10 applying candidates will be selected to receive 2 years of support in terms of mentoring, book publishing, and connection to BredaPhoto's extensive network of curators and museums and galleries. So we're going to start with the video by Christina Sazalay from Moholy Nagy University, and I'm sorry if I didn't do a good job with the name, and Sarah Hornig from Lab University of Applied Sciences in Lahti, Finland. So we'll tee that up.
My name is Christina. It's been 5 years since I first set foot in a Chinese market that is based in Budapest. A whole new kind of world opened for me, and I realized I found another city within the place I live. I was amazed that the diversity of nationalities here can be compared to anywhere else in Hungary. About 30 years ago, due to the loosened up visa barrier, the number of Chinese people grew from almost zero to about 27,000 in Hungary in just a few years. The location of my work is the Chinese market in Budapest, which became the center of the Hungarian Chinese community as well. Locals always have second thoughts about the market because in the media it is often connected to illegal imports or raids, but on the other hand, it is a good access to cheaper products. It is constantly observed by the Hungarian National Tax and Customs Administration, but to no avail because it seems almost impossible to catch anyone in the act of committing a crime. Although nowadays not only Chinese people are working here, but Vietnamese, Mongolians, Romanians, Turkish, Afghans and Ukrainians, still Hungarians call the market Chinese market because they have difficulties to make difference between nations and appearances. Although the photography part is almost over, the shaping of the final form of the book and its spreading are unknown field for me. So in the following 2 years, the Breda Mentor program can have a significant effect on the lead of tasks in front of me. From formation of the structure, consultation with book designers to publishing, preparation of the financing plan of the book, and targeting audience are challenging steps ahead of me. What the program can help me at this point is connecting me with publishers, places that sell photo books, and helping me make the book known as widely as possible. Besides all these, I would like to develop my artistic integrity and manage my upcoming projects. The reason for that is for the time being there is no unity in my works because of my diversified interests, which makes the strengthening of my artistic tone more difficult. I would like my series of the future to be directed to one unity more purposefully that can help me have a recognizable style in time.
Hi everyone, I'm Sarah Huanich. I'm a photographer and social worker from Helsinki, Finland. I graduated from Lahti LAB 3 years ago, and I'm mainly concentrating on sensitive and societal topics. After graduating, I've been mostly concentrating on doing freelance photography and my own projects, and currently I also work as a daily job in child welfare with teenagers who are school dropouts, together with a teacher. What I enjoy the most in photography is in-depth and long-term projects. And now I will introduce one project to you, which was actually my thesis from Lahti. Enjoy! In a nutshell, I would describe myself as a documentary photographer who has a passion for creating unconventional visual approaches for topics which are not so visible in everyday life. So why do I apply? Although I've been working as a freelance photographer, I haven't started an own long-term project after graduating. Although that's what I enjoy the most, and I think which is the strongest part in my photographical work. I would choose a topic from the world, from my daily job. So it would be about school dropouts, the phenomenon school dropouts, or their families. And as a worker, like on a long-term project, I am patient and hardworking, and I get enthusiastic very easily, and I'm a good dialogue partner as well. So I think I would benefit from a mentor a lot. I guess that's it. Short 3 minutes after me about me. I hope all of you enjoy the festival and hope to see you soon. Ciao.
Wonderful. Thank you and good luck to these two candidates. So I'm going to share screen so that we can, okay. Okay, I hope you can all see that. Okay, so I'll introduce myself very, very quickly. My name is Mohamed Somji. I'm from Tanzania, but have lived in Dubai, United Arab Emirates for all my life. And I have had the pleasure of being involved in BredaPhoto for the last 6 years, first as an artist exhibitor, and then as an associate curator in 2018 and in 2020. And it's been a wonderful experience, and they've been very gracious and open in you know, experimenting with the work that we're showing, and also kind of pushing the bar with the work that's being shown that I brought in from the Middle East. And I think they have always been very receptive to my you know, my ideas on the kind of work that we want to put out, and also the programming. So I'm, you know, very thankful to the rest of the BredaPhoto team for giving me this opportunity. I run Gulf Photo Plus in Dubai, which is a photography center, and we're a platform for photographers around the region in the Middle East and in North Africa to showcase their work, but also to learn from resources that we can provide them, host exhibitions and talks, and yeah, and so Tanya, for example, is one of the people who we've brought over to teach young photographers, and we'll talk more about that coming up. So in the KPN building in Breda, if when you weave your way toward the center of the building, you'll come across the work of Tanya Habjouqa, who I'll introduce in a second. This work is called A Sacred Space Oddity. It's a breathtaking body of work that is an elegiac meditation on the interaction of the physical and psychological space encompassed in that loaded phrase that we've all heard, the Holy Land. Her work draws out the complexities, contradictions, and instabilities etched into the lives of the land's occupied and occupying populations, tracing the ways our lives, and as you will hear tonight, deaths are overlapped by competing and overlapping mythologies. Jan Scharlekens, the co-curator, and has done a fantastic job for making this installation look really wonderful in this kind of Boltanski-esque approach, and it's a transmedia project. So there's videos and there's still photographs. And I think if you are in Breda or in Holland, or you're in Europe and you're able to make it before the 25th, go see it. So that brings me to this to the artist who's produced this work, Tanya Habjouqa. I'm very proud to call Tanya a friend. She has been a mentor, and we met a decade ago, I think, in Spain at a workshop, and have stayed in touch ever since. So Tanya is born in Jordan and raised between Texas and the Middle East. She's earned a reputation for documentary that brings politics and creative vision in the same frame. Her focus on gender, identity, and social political issues in the Middle East has always included a layer of gravitas and an intuitive sense of metaphor beneath her work. Her work is, I know it's cliched to say poetic, but you know, it's you know, it's beyond that. It always draws you in and has a lot of questions and meaning, and you know, every bit of her image has been, you know, well thought through, and she's really a tour de force in that sense in terms of the work that she produces. She's an artist, educator, and member of Noor Images, and she's been taking long-term series-based approach, immersed in research and interlaying journalistic, academic, conceptual, and documentary practices. Her projects have been commended by the likes of World Press Photo, Time, and the Smithsonian, and she's hired by the organizations such as Amnesty International to make multi-country media campaigns. And I think one of the biggest things that Tanya has had an impact and is going to leave a legacy behind is her work for the Arab Documentary Photography Program. In fact, one of the other artists that we brought into Breda, Mohamed Kilito, is you know, somebody who has been involved with that program, and many others through Tanya's guidance and mentorship. That is a program together with the Arab Arab Fund for Art and Culture, the Prince Claus Fund, and Magnum Foundation. And that is Tanya, and we'll hear from her in a bit. And I'd like to, you know, it's with immense pleasure to introduce and to have with us Professor Nadera Shalhoub-Kevorkian, who I'm very nervous to be on this panel with, because she's just a brilliant mind, and we've been very fortunate to have her join us tonight. She is a Palestinian feminist who is the Lawrence D. Beale Chair in Law at the Faculty of Law-Institute of Criminology and the School of Social Work and Public Welfare at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and the Global Chair in Law, Queen Mary University of London. Her research focuses on trauma, state crimes and criminology, surveillance, gender violence, law and society, and genocide studies. She studies the crime of femicide and other forms of gender-based violence, violence against children in conflict-ridden areas, crimes of abuse of power in settler colonial contexts, surveillance, securitization, and social control. Dr. Shalhoub-Kevorkian is the author of numerous books, amongst them Militarization and Violence Against Women in Conflict Zones in the Middle East, The Palestinian Case Study, published in 2010, Security Theology, Surveillance and the Politics of Fear, published by Cambridge University Press in 2015. And she's just published a new book examining Palestinian childhood entitled Incarcerated Childhood and the Politics of Unchilding, and a new edited book entitled Understanding Campus Community Partnerships in Conflict Zones, and is currently co-editing 2 new books on the sacralization of politics and its effect on human suffering, and Islam and gender-based violence. As a resident of the old city of Jerusalem, Shalhoub-Kevorkian is a prominent local activist. She engages in direct actions and critical dialogue to end the inscription of power over children's lives, spaces of death, and women's birthing bodies and lives. And we've just discovered that on Saturday, she was awarded the 2020 Impact Award for her path-breaking research on Israeli military occupation and state violence against Palestinians through a feminist criminological approach. So congratulations, Dr. Nadera. And I think you will find that the conversation that between Tanya and Dr. Nadera is going to be you know, very insightful in terms of the work that they both do. And I think the work that they both do fits, you know, each other perfectly in their assertions and their, and you know, what they're trying to draw upon. So I'm going to start, Tanya, by kind of putting you on the spot and asking you about the statement that you made yesterday when we were having a chat, saying that photography has failed us in Palestine. Especially with regards to the documentation of human rights abuses and what it does to the person and the land in occupied Palestine. So I'd like you to expand on that and tell us why photography has failed and how it has failed and what you're doing to you know, counter that.
So I actually had that thought recently on assignment. I was on assignment for Le Monde, the French, one of my favorite French daily newspapers, and I was photographing Ahed Tamimi, who, and if you don't know her, she's worth looking up. She's a young lady who, as a child, grew up in front of the cameras. Her father is an activist of the non-violent resistance in their village, and she, if you put her name in, you will just see image after image from the time she was a wee tot, confronting soldiers, putting on this face of strength, like images that a child would normally appear terrified, just masking that. And then of course she was arrested and came into the mainstream media a couple of years ago. So I was photographing her, and her young cousin, who's studying media, she just began as a student, was watching me agonize over every little detail of the portrait. Like it's supposed to be her and her father, and her shoulder was a little bit turned, and it appeared almost as if she was shunning her father. And so students started to ask me questions: why so much detail, why so much time? You know, of course, a kid coming from selfie culture. And I said, you know, think about it in Palestine. Not that there's a lack of images documenting the violence or the dead or the oppressed, wounded, etc. There's no lack of journalism here. On the contrary, it's a hyper-narrated reality to some degree. But despite this imagery of various wars in Gaza, on and on and on, somehow the Palestinian narrative never really finds a space. It's always contested. Even if we look at the Netherlands, if we look at the World Press Photo in 2013, and this solemn image of a child killed that was killed by the Israeli military, and he was, you know, the father solemnly walking the child in his arms, and then it became, it's manipulated, it's oversaturated. And that's the thing, is that it's quite common in media to focus on these inane details. It was not colored any differently than the majority of winning images and the style of the day, but it's a way of taking the conversation away from the substance of the matter. And this happens again and again. So coming from a background of anthropology and working for years as a journalist, I didn't feel empowered to, you know, my work was edited. I didn't have a say in what was being represented. And I constantly felt uncomfortable with that. And so the work that you're going to see, we're going to show you a process of development of where I rejected the mainstream. I'm very devoted to the traditional ethics of journalism, of representation, and every detail being put forward. But I think that we really have to start questioning the sort of idea of an outsider having more of a truth than somebody who was locally telling their own story. I think all of this is changing, and I also think that there's a murky middle rising. I think it's an exciting time for documentary, where we're incorporating sociology, anthropology, psychology, theater, performance, but especially bringing in the voices of those that we're photographing. So Occupied Pleasures was a turning point for me. I had moved, I'm not Palestinian, that's the thing. So I always struggle with voice. I'm always very careful how I voice, how I frame things, because even though I'm married to a Palestinian, I'm raising two Palestinian children, I have immense privilege of mobility that the majority don't. So that's one of the things that I do. And so I was married, I had just moved after years of documenting in and out. Palestine was home, and I was pregnant with my first child and really struggling with some of the nature of assignments that I was getting. And trying to think on a deeper level, if you change the slide, trying to think on a deeper level about representation. And this was the precursor to Occupied Pleasures. I went to Gaza, really had difficult getting access. And I started to dare to sort of break the expected mainstream rules. So now this is what I push my students to do as well, is to think. Don't be a lemming. If you're just regurgitating the same image that already exists, what's the point? And so it was and it was right after the 2009 Operation Cast Lead, so much horrific devastation. And media was basically saying, oh, Hamas, women's rights. And I'm not a fan of Hamas, but literally this devastating war had just happened, and yet the main conversation was hijacked to that. So I decided to ironically go in and focus on women of Gaza, and then use that as the microcosm for the greater society. And so this image, for example, entire neighborhoods were devastated. There was already in Gaza a completely compressed space of existence. There were limited space already, but in these neighborhoods, so a gym would become a public space where people would have groups to talk to therapists, etc. And so this is a group of women exercising. And initially they said they didn't want to be photographed. And then they said, okay, as long as you promise us, when you show this image, you will explain why we're wearing the jilbab, because we know how we're mocked. They're going to say, oh, these poor oppressed Muslim women wearing a jilbab while they're exercising. We're wearing this because we are here in this public space and there's no privacy because our neighborhood has been devastated. If we change slides. So here we go into occupied pleasures, and this is one of the images. And again, in Gaza, oh, do you want to go back? So this is Sabah. At the time she was 14. This was 2013, I took the image. And again, occupied pleasures. For me, once I put these two words together, it was the literal occupation and the metaphoric one. It was how I noticed that people, a lot of the violence is a crippling, slow, emotionally draining violence of bureaucracy. And so there are so many mental, verbal games, tricks to the mind that people play to get through the staggering bureaucracies, long waits at checkpoints, etc. And so occupied pleasures was a play on those words. Sabah, actually, I was looking for her the entire summer. I found her on the last day of the shoot, of the 3-week shoot. I was pregnant and I was photographing, and a wave had come and lifted my entire shirt above my very pregnant belly. And I suddenly felt a little tender hand because I was so focused on taking a picture. And the touch was not obtrusive. Somehow I felt safe. So I just continued taking the pictures, and it was her little hand quietly appearing and pulling my shirt down. She was an amazing young lady. This is one of my favorites. It's the cover from my book, and it was also in the World Press Photo winning series in 2014 for Daily Life. This is a metaphor. This is an area in the West Bank, a beautiful green area. Anywhere where there's water or open spaces, it's occupied by the so-called Israeli Park Recreation Reserve. And Palestinians do not have access over these areas. And in fact, when they go, quite often they're regulated, they're treated to a different set of standards. And so the entire day, anytime a Palestinian child or father would on a really hot summer day, they would get screamed at by the Israeli lifeguards. Meanwhile, you had Israeli teens lounging with guns, spears, doing whatever they wanted. And so this one kid, he just stoked my curiosity. And at the end of the day, when it was time to go home and the guard was leaving, he just stealthily ran and just in the air and belly flopped into the water and just floated there. And it was this beautiful freedom, but it was somewhere, it was symbolic of death and hope for me. Next. And this image is probably where I really, at this point, decided to change my approach in documentary and go less classic. Like, this was the definitive moment. This was in the World Press Photo. And it's funny because there was a debate around this image, which I found absurd. Young man who wants to be an actor. I identified early on that he would be someone to photograph. There was no photograph in the first moment that I met him, so I kept in touch. Called him on the last day of Ramadan, said, hey, what are you up to? He said, I'm going to buy a sheep to fatten up for the next Eid. And I said, hey, can I join you? Can I buy the sheep with you? Because he was such a funny character. And he was like, yeah. And but the bottleneck, I lived at the time on the other side of that wall in Beit Hanina. And it just took forever to cross. And I finally said, Tanya, I'm going to go get the sheep. And I just begged him. I said, okay, just wait for me. And this is usually a bottleneck of chaos and traffic, but this is right before the last, Adhan, the last Eid meal. And so, Ramadan meal. And so I ran up and the light was going, and he said, this sheep, I've spent some time with her because you were late. And the sheep, I named it Haifa Wahbi, which is a really sexy Lebanese pop star. He said, but then I figured out it's a boy. I'm like, Ya Zalime, I don't want to know why you figured this out, but okay. He's like, yeah, so I named it Morsi, who of course was on his way to being deposed at the time. So at this point, Morsi, the sheep, was in the back seat. And I had this dilemma, one light, man, sheep, screw it, throw it in the middle. And as I threw the light in and lifted my camera, and at that moment, and this is ironically was controversial, he took the sheep and pulled it into the front seat And then, as if the gift was amazing, that picture would have been enough. But he knew the joke, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, and he turned with his cigarette in because he had this humor. And this was his commentary on the absurdity of this occupation. And it was a collaborative, beautiful portrait that I love to this day. But some people tried to say, oh, when he moved the sheep, you should have put the camera down. Why? Why can't he have a say in his representation? Absurd. Luckily, the conversation has gone on since 2014, and I think this is a little less controversial. Next. Which brings us to, again, at this point, I dipped my toe in and started to feel a bit more fair, that there was more depth to the work that I was doing, right? And so at this point, the first project I just focused on and sort of silent character of the state as a character, the state of the occupation, the Israeli state of occupation as a character, but there were no Israelis in the character. At this point, we're talking 10 years on of living here. No, sorry, at that point, 8 years on, I'm a little more frustrated. I'm a little more fatigued myself by living with this constant bureaucracy of violence. Again, with privilege, I'm already exhausted. So I can, and then documenting those who are more exhausted. So Sacred Space Oddity, if we change the slide. At this point, I decided to go a little more Grimm's fairy tale. I learned at this point that where a lot of work, brilliant documentary work done by some brave journalists documenting the violence head on, it's there, and yet we're still having these circular conversations decades after the occupation somehow. So something's not working. So I started to reevaluate, and I realized that with Occupied Pleasures and the sort of metaphoric playful, seemingly playful approach, I was able to bring critical conversations in. So I decided to take it further. And next image. And I decided to engage with characters all around. It's like it's a medley of characters, sort of taking inspiration from Fellini. There's these wide cast of characters, and no one is idyllic or good per se, but there's this seeming charm. But then you go a layer beyond, and you see something darker, like in oh gosh, I'm forgetting the name of the Fellini movie now, but they'll come to me. So at this point, so I go back. So at this point, you have to also think strategically. How do you the true level of violence, when I mention again the bureaucracy, these things can't be photographed. And a lot of the things that I want to photograph, whether it's, oh.
Tanya, you're good?
Yeah, I'm trying to sign back in. That was weird. I don't
No, you're
see
fine.
you though.
We hear you.
You hear me, but I don't see, hold on 1 second. That was bizarre. Okay.
Oh, now we've lost her. Okay, we'll give it a second there. She's coming back. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. There we are. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. That was bizarre.
That's all right.
Anyway, at this point, how do you photograph? You don't have access to the prisoners. You don't have access. There's literal restriction on movement of humans to their homes, let alone journalists getting access. For example, the case of Palestinian prisoners having to smuggle their sperm in candy wrappers. They're denied conjugal rights. I don't have access to those. So I started to think about, there's plenty of photography bravely documenting the obvious landscape of the occupation. So how can we, as we say in Arabic, how can we go underneath? How can we, sometimes when you're restricted, you actually can get more creative. And also simultaneously, it's, you don't always have funding to do these things. So when I'm on assignment, because I know we have some students here, like this image here, this was from an NGO assignment, and quite often NGO assignments, quite often they want this sort of reductive, obvious, crying child portrait, etc. Some NGOs are a little more creative, but what I do now, whether I'm on an assignment for a newspaper, NGO, or something that's not my own, is I ensure it's a wasted opportunity if you don't come out with an image for yourself that tells the story that you see, that maybe that they're never going to go with. So in this case, Trump had just announced the annexation of Jerusalem, and by chance, these social workers were putting up a play for kids, and it had this beautiful picture of Al-Aqsa and the Dome of the Rock in the background. Next. And then to play with symbols. This is where we get, so for example, this image I wouldn't put in a traditional news edit, but in my personal documentary work, I would. And so I played with the Old Testament. I researched Hagar and Sarah and the sort of epic, bitchy relationship between them. And of course, it's always been represented that Hagar was a surly, ungrateful, but I mean, at the end of the day, she was a slave and she, you know, was forced to have a child with Abraham. And that story fascinated me. And so I thought about that, and supposedly it happened in Hebron. And of course, you know, Ismail, the boy, and the mother, Hagar, were kicked out into the desert. And so I started to research this, figuring out where it would be. And I looked, and it happened to be, there would have been a trajectory if indeed they walked to Saudi, if we believe any of these things. But again, it's about narratives, about playing. It's about playing with narrative to uncover other ideas. And so Al-Raqib, it's a Bedouin community inside Israel. And this community in the last 10 years has been demolished 173 times. And they're very active. And so I visited this day with the story in the back of my mind. And this child was building a well because the well had been demolished recently. And of course, you think about being cast into the desert, the Zamzam, the water. And so I was talking to the mother and thinking about the story. And so it became somewhere between play and a portrait of truth, somewhere in this murky middle. But somewhere in this murky middle is a greater truth for me. Next. And again, one of the things that was interesting is recently I had a critique by a Palestinian curator who was frustrated when he saw the pictures of this project, which is, it's a wide project and an amazing Dutch book designing it. So you'll see more soon, hopefully. But he was frustrated that the Palestinians, he almost used it as a critique of anger. Like the Israelis, for example, in this scene, these are Israeli nudists, enthusiasts. They're in the Sea of the Galilee, the famous, you know, supposedly walking on water. And just, he said, all of the pictures of the Israelis in nature just seem at ease and space is open, and the majority of the Palestinian imagery, they're encased. Why is this? It's not, and I said, why do you think about what you're asking me? And then he kind of took a step back and realized, because this is in fact the reality and the lay of the land, but you still have to, you know, think about the representation that you're putting out and be very careful. And that's why text is essential to my work. And each of these images in the book and actually in the exhibit that was very thoughtfully laid out, I was very grateful that Breda gave attention to my request that the details in the text were essential. Otherwise, it's just absurdist, weird images. What does that mean? It's the test. It's that twist that I'm trying to play at. You experience one thing and assume something and then go back. If we go backwards, for example, this is the previous image. This is, sorry, the guy with the blue hat. This is a Purim festival, and it's almost sort of like a carnival, a Jewish festival. And this happens to be in a very hardcore settlement, and it was like a giant rave. There were drugs, there were kids were drunk, there was like crazy rave music, and he was a psychedelic sheep herder without any irony, because the thing is that this settlement is surrounded by villages, but there's an unawareness, a sort of blissful unawareness. And it became also difficult because you want to be true and respectful to the people that you're documenting. But at the same time, a friend of mine got upset, another Palestinian friend, and he said, the Israelis seem more interesting than we do. So we can change imagery. Again, this is another open area of Palestinian wall, but controlled by the Israeli Nature Park Reserve. Another metaphoric image. Next. Detail of a mother being carried weekly to a protest, a dead mother, if we go back, a dead mother being carried in a purse as the mother protests weekly to allow the mother to be buried beside her husband and being refused by the military. But these little the little details of keeping the self and how reduced they are. So here we are. I had someone looking at the pictures, we could dwell here for a minute, including the pictures of the nudists. And he said, the Israelis seem more interesting than we do. And he was upset. And I said, you want to know what? I said, to be honest, to photograph them, at times they are. Because while there's a distrust initially, who are you, what the hell do you want? Once you get past it, there's this freedom of space and a sort of freedom to just be. Whereas in the very contained reality of Palestine, there's multiple factors that would yield people to being more paranoid of revealing themselves, whether it's a very small enclosed community, lack of space and judgment of their own community, or more practically, if they speak about an issue, will there be retribution, jail, having an ID revoked, etc. So he said, you know what, Tanya, you show up at my house at this time and I'll show you. And I really had no idea what I would find. And I showed up, and I don't want to give too much away. You can see he's masked, but he happens to be what he calls a cultural Palestinian Christian. And he said, this is our space. The way to worship God is through love and sex and touch. But he actually believes that the closures, the constant closures and suffocation is suffocating any sort of release like this at a greater level in society. Next. Images of a, you can pay like $100 and learn how to protect yourself and go on and it's, they don't actually say Arab, but the boogeymen are actually Arabs, and it's basically Americans, French, tourists from all over the world go into this occupied West Bank, and it's like a game in Gush Etzion, and they hold pretend guns, and then they get real BB guns and shoot. Again, when I photograph, I'm very much inspired by Raymond Carver, and I try every image should have a layered short story element. One image should contain almost like a perfect short story, as this one does. Next, I want to get to Dr. Nadera. And here I think we could bring in, so here's another point before we give the floor to Dr. Nadera, Professor Nadera. As I became increasingly agitated by assignments where I would produce images that I'd been producing for 10 years, the narrative wasn't changing despite me and thousands of other journalists giving these images and doing it dutifully and doing it well researched. And I started to think about how can we play, how can we subvert? And in these assignments where I would meet, so like for example, this happened to be an NGO assignment, and the children kept whispering about a very violent settler, a French settler actually, named Didi. And he was very near, you could see Didi's house. His house was a bit down from the rest of the settlement, very near, almost across the road. And they would whisper his name, the children terrified. And Didi was particularly violent, and this little girl witnessed Didi once came and put his hand forward, pretending to shake the hand of her father. And of course, in the relationship, despite having had violence before, he had no choice but to put his hand. And when he put his hand forward, it was pulled forward. And he headbutted him so violently that the father fell on the floor and blood spurted out in front of the child. So here she's pretending to be a sort of, it's an irony. I start to think about layers and symbols, but they all happen quite naturally in the field. The father was plowing the field and the land and trauma of the child. And so she's pretending to be a sleeping beauty here, but then also whispering about Didi. Perhaps here we could open up the floor. As I try to understand and go deeper, I know my limitations as a journalist, and I really started to turn to academics that I feel have more freedom in many ways to analyze and far more expertise in theory. And I really turned Dr. Nadera's approach to biopolitics, necropolitics, and unchilding and beyond is next level. And actually, this is where I'm really dwelling, is increasingly going in here. I go between Old Testament history books, short stories, proverbs, and professors like Nadera to try to enrich the approach. I'll turn the floor over here.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect, thank you.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Tanya. And thank you for the opportunity. I think that just while hearing you, I was thinking about how what you're calling us to do is to think against the binary mode of seeing and of perceiving, and even taking us to places where not only talking about biopolitics, but rather talking about the politics of viscerality, how affects are part of what we're seeing, what we're performing, whether when you're talking about the kid that jumped in the water, or whether you're talking about the different settlers that are dancing. It is about how do you see what is seen and what is unseen, what is performed, why is it performed, and it's playing to whose hands. You know, the political economy of the performativity. And in addition to this, and if I will further complicate it, I will also look at the governance of this performativity, because one thing that is clear in your work is also how do you narrate what is not seen and what is not counted and what is not even noticed, and how can you narrate it, like looking at this child, that narration is from the wound. She has seen her father being abused, being attacked, and then she's trying to perform something that would give her the power to re-narrate a different narrative, an anti-hegemonic narrative. So if I start by looking at your work, and especially when we're going back to the title of your work, which is The Unholy, the Holy Unholy, is that maybe I need to remind you all that we're talking about the settler colonial space that you're photographing. So it's, and settler colonial dispossession is performed through various forms of violence, be it the biopolitical, where we're looking at demographic, the perception, the framing of the Palestinian as a demographic threat, and the way the body and land are in one place, and therefore this binary analysis does not work. You need to further complicate it. So settler colonial dispossession is really performed through violence. It's justified by cultural, and this is why you go to the culture, to the biblical, to the, and so on, historical, religious, and national imperatives. You know, religious is clear. If God was turned into a real estate agent, whereby he's giving the land to one group and dispossessing the other. And then you have the security theology, as I say in my book on the security theology and the politics of fear. And there is a production of fear, to fear the other, to produce the other as a feared one. And therefore that settler would hit her father and would think that God gave him the land. So therefore, like, Tanya's work really speaks to what some forms of violence that are seen, the biopolitical, the necropolitical, and how Palestinians, and maybe here my concept of the governance of hope, because what the state is doing constantly is really controlling and governing our hopes. And what we see among Palestinians, whether in Al-Araqib, where they will continue to interrupt that governance of hope and the control over the land. And I see it, you know, in my own work. I see it, for example, in my work on Palestinian dead bodies, yeah? Because my work on dead bodies really started with someone in the family, a cousin dying, and our inability to bury him, because the death certificate should be approved by an Israeli doctor. The approval for the burial should come from the Ministry of the Israeli Ministry of Health, and the entire route to barrier, where his sisters are in Ramallah and they can't come see him, and we need to bury him in Jerusalem, and how can we do it? And this is how I started my entire research, whereby I was so-called interviewing dead bodies from the moment they died till the moment they were buried, and tried to check that route. And where that photo of them, the guy with the sheep that you showed on Qalandia, is exactly where in one of the cases of the Palestinian dead but in living bodies, where I interviewed, whereby he crossed the checkpoint. He's Jerusalemite. He crossed the checkpoint. He had a permit because he studied in the US, and when he came here, his ID was revoked, but his family still had the Jerusalemite ID, so they lived by the checkpoint. So when he crossed the checkpoint, he was allowed to pass. He passed, he had a heart attack in his house, and the family tried to bring him back to bury him in Jerusalem. And when they came to the checkpoint to take him back after 12 hours, the Israeli soldiers said, well, he had a permit to pass as a living body. Now as a dead body, he doesn't have it. And they were unable to bring him back to bury him in the family barrier. So the wife ended up sneaking his dead body in order to bury. So the writing over the Palestinian dead body, things that are the performed power of the state is there all the time. And therefore, you know, when I saw this photo and I told you I saw a graveyard and you told me, no, Nadera, this is a checkpoint. This is all what came to my mind is my interview with that dead body, that when he crossed as a living body, he was permitted, you know, his governance by this political system that is called, you know, the settler colonial system, to pass, to cross, the right to passage, but as a dead body, he was forbidden to come. And here exactly where my kind of work on necropolitics and the power of the state to build a necropenological and necropolitical. I say necropenological because it's also penalizing the dead, penalizing the family, penalizing the community. Like I needed to step out of my car when my cousin was dead. And this is a cousin who took care of me when I was a bride. I changed my bridal dress at his place and so on. And then I needed to plead to the soldiers to let him cross in that casket. And they opened the casket actually, and they checked him and blood started coming out. I was so traumatic for a person like me to see, you know, my a dear uncle being treated so violently even when dead. So necropolitics is hard at work in this place, and this is where like the form of forced confinement of the living, while I speak to what goes on. Yeah.
Tanya, can I put this next video on the astronaut one, and you can talk a little bit about it as well. And I just want to point out that Tanya's work, the Sacred Space Oddity, includes a lot of video and GIFs, and we're going to see later this rock as well. Let me know, Tanya. I have it teed up, so whenever you're ready, we can talk about that.
Fantastic.
But I'll just play this one.
So again, the sort of, I think traditional photography, and certainly, you know, the perfectly edited sequence, 12 images, and I think photography, it's far more exciting. It has the potential, and it's going in a far more interesting, like there's the Reala Azuleh, sort of, I don't want to say the new Susan Sontag to reduce her, but she's an Israeli, a left-wing Israeli who's taking photography, an academic and based in the West now, who's taking photography to another level, questioning, can photography challenge state citizenship, enclosures, and more. And this is where photography is interesting me, is when you don't have access, when you're reduced, can we use it in a more revolutionary way? And I think the answer is yes. And I think that this is coming from the ground. And I think that where the traditional sort of legacy media has controlled imagery, or even we could say conventional art spaces, okay? I think that with Instagram and collectivity, and I think certainly during the pandemic and people being stuck inside and reaching out virtually to speak, to connect, I think there's a lot of exciting things happening. And I feel like the struggle that I've had to get where I am to voice and experiment, I see the younger generation of photographers are sort of already there, and that's exciting. For me, a photograph is, I'm a bit bored by a perfect picture. I'm trying to have an image, and for me, an image or the sound of a crackling, if you just get the audio of the crunching of pebbles under your foot, whatever it is, I'm like a crow when I'm in the field, grabbing every little bit, a fluttering paper, a clue. It's all clues and essences. And increasingly, for example, at the Breda Festival, amazingly installed by Jan, there's an audio soundtrack of all of the radio, because when you're in the field, it's this powerful space where there's clues. And I'm always, again, setting up checkpoints, driving all over the country. And I have an audio soundtrack of the radio stations interrupting each other. The Rolling Stones interrupted by Call to Prayer, and Kulthum's or Egyptian pop song interrupted by harsh Hebrew news, like on and on and on. And so there's all of these clues, and it's all part of the experience. And sometimes the clues are different, and increasingly I'm trying to work with the individuals that I photograph collaboratively. And so if you push play, I went to Jalazon refugee camp And this is, I have stills and imagery. This is a kid who dreams of being an astronaut, but he comes from a very loving but economically depressed family in this refugee camp. And so we wandered around. He put this suit on, and I kind of wanted to see where he wanted to go. And there's really not a lot of open space. Ironically, the only open space is this graveyard, right? And this is a graveyard that was never intended to be a graveyard. It began taking bodies in 1948. And I guess I just wanted to play with the absurdity, but also play with the images of how, and actually sci-fi is a perfect, and I'm certainly not the first. There's so many Palestinian photographers and filmmakers that turn to sci-fi to narrate this place, because it's such an absurd reality, and even furthermore absurd that people around the world can't seem to understand that it's wrong, that it's so the absurdity gets compounded somewhat. And I think that surrealist mode sometimes becomes the only way of narrating this place, and also a coping mechanism. Nader, did you want to say anything about this image, or should we go on to the next one?
Yeah, it's just the fact that you're talking about a child, and I think that it's striking, because you're talking about life, you're talking about death, and you're talking about childhood. And I think that it's really fascinating. And you're talking about an astronaut, which means, you know, going back to my point on the governance of hope, and how children are really interrupting state's governance of hope. And by wearing this suit, and by walking around, even in that small caged zone, it's still an interruption, his own interruption. Yeah.
And if we go to the next, oh, sorry, go ahead, Samji.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna move on to this idea that, you know, Tanya, well, you have spent the last few years working on this project, trying to, you know, trying to co-opt the image to be able to show these absurdities and these, you know, making the profane sacred and making the sacred profane. You know, Dr. Nadera, your work is looking a lot at how the state uses the image to, you know, further cement its occupation, like you've said, you know, whether it's a governance of hope, but also to kind of, you know, consolidate their hold psychologically and physically using the image. And, you know, you have this essay, which I'd like you to just talk about really, the occupation of the senses, and I have those images that I can tee up when you're ready. So if you can just talk about the use of the image on the other side.
Yeah. Yes, I think that this is exactly, it really resonates with what Tanya was able to capture. And in my work and on the occupation of the senses, I felt that it's not only the occupation of the land, it's not only the occupation of life and livability, it's not only the occupation of the place of death, it's also the occupation of the senses, what you see. And over here you see Arabs out. It's the sensory technologies that manage the body, that manages the language, the sight, the time, the space in the colony. So you see it in here, you see it in the rest of the various here. So for example, it's using that sacredness. So Muhammad is a pig, or if you'll see the other images, you know, Jesus is the son of Mary, is a whore. And the writings on walls is also about the writings, the colors, the power of the bombs, the tear gas bombs, the soldiers in the place, the colors are all about the occupation of the senses. So over here, it's also the burning of olive trees. And you know that how important olive trees are for Palestinians. It's about continuity, it's about belonging, it carries so many meanings. So it's hitting the meanings of our concerns and telling us you can't even control, we can burn it all, we can write Arabs out and you're trashed and unfortunately, it's also turned into cultural events. So we have the Light Festival in Jerusalem, and this is like the entrance to Damascus Gate. And it looks beautiful to people. And I needed to convince so many of my colleagues that this this is very violent to me. Those colors are telling a different story. The narration is about the erasure. It's built. And over here, for example, you have this old man that his mouth moves, yeah, and he is telling a story. So his story, his narration is exactly a story of the settler colonial state, because it tells you that, you know, he's telling you about the history of the Jewish people, and nobody is saying there is no history. But when there's only one narrative where you're erasing the other, it's embedded in the logic of elimination. And therefore it is the occupation of the senses. So it looks nice. It sounds, the music sounds, you were, Tanya, talking about Kulthum. Kulthum is being used in bar mitzvot, in bat mitzvot, in celebrations. So it's also, you know, it's also like the hummus and the falafel. It's stealing the food and it's stealing the colors. It's stealing, it's also controlling the senses, what you feel, what you hear, what you smell, to the degree of, you know, the kids that I interview, a kid who was shot in his eye, and I finished my article with the shot in his eye, and he was telling me how bad was it. He came back, I told him what's the story, and he said that he came back from school and he was very hungry. He rushed home in Aisawi, but when they saw him rushing, they shot him, and when he was shot, he lost his eye, he had lots of blood, his mom was crying, and so on. So for an hour he was telling me about the pain he went through. And then I told him at the end, طيب إيش نسوي? What can we do? And his reaction was, خلاص ما عدتش أجوع. I'm not going to be hungry anymore. Like, that tells you how the occupation is beyond any narration that can be captured. And therefore photographers should really work really harder to allow the voice from the wound to speak back.
And that's great. You know, that's beautiful. And I think that your advice to photographers is something that, you know, Tanya, for example, has very much taken to heart. And Tanya, can I ask you at this juncture, like, you know, the response to this work and, you know, where you are becoming metaphorical and using a lot of, you know, abstract concepts. Is this, you know, you talked about this interaction with tune, for example. Can you tell us, like, you know, is this something that will hopefully make a dent? And is this something you're actively telling your students to go beyond this, you know, spectacular image of violence that we're all so used to?
Yeah, I think there's a rebellious element that I have. Like, if someone, if I have an obtuse presence not allowing me access, if I'm controlled and someone says no, like it's an authoritative voice saying no, and it's something that should be documented, I almost look at it as a challenge. And I'm like, oh yeah, screw you. And I will find a way. And I'll come back to your question, but to give, if we go to the next slide, or we can just stay there. For example, in this project, it's really the Sacred Space Oddity, Unholy Land is comprised of 3 main chapters, touching on necropolitics, biopolitics, geopolitics. And in terms of biopolitics, again, I think we're up to 76 children, babies that have been born from smuggled sperm in chocolate wrappers, in chip bags, in lighters, and emptied lighter, you know, where lighter fluid would be, like, instead of, and how do I photograph that? It's an important story. And photography, again, it's not just about a pretty image. It's got the potential to be about so much more. It could be an investigation, data, psychology, it could be all of these things. And so, for example, where there's a no, you can always find a way. And in this case, I befriended people in one of the labs that was allowing that allowed these births, you know, that helped bring these births to fruition. And I got images inside the lab, and then they shared with me images, microscopic images of the sperm and the process of insemination. And then I juxtaposed this against interviews that I conducted, along with an amazing radio show every Friday called Asra, where you're normally very private people, but they have it's interesting because I feel like audio is a space that people are more comfortable here, and people are increasingly exploring that because there's less fear of retribution and being discovered. So people will call every Friday into this radio show children, parents, fathers, wives, professing their love, their angst, missing their loved ones in jail, and hoping maybe there's a chance that there's a smuggled phone or radio in the jail. And so I juxtaposed the swimming sperm with this. And what I'm finding is with my students in the Arab documentary photo program funded by Prince Claus, thank you Netherlands, and AFAC, Arab Fund for Arts and Culture, and of course Magnum Foundation, along with 3 other amazing mentors, there's a revolution, there's a documentary revolution happening. And if you look at, especially in Egypt, increasingly in the last few decades, there are more oppressive mechanisms and regimes coming into play. And it's harder to narrate. And so this sort of absurdist, in a way, it's already hard to narrate to begin with here. There's very high consequences to narrating certain things in our region. And so I feel like the Iranian photographers were sort of ahead of us in disguising real social issues behind art. And so we are utilizing sort of different to talk about really critical political things. And what I find is because there are so many restrictions, be it state or be it societal, in terms of areas that certain topics that are taboo or conservative, that the experimental approaches that our students are taking, like one of them, Omar Iman, he's now, he's at the Rijksmuseum. He was a Syrian refugee. Now he's a high-flying artist in the Netherlands. They're taking their narratives and they're doing far more interesting. They're working collaboratively. They're engaging in different methodologies, and the work is going on another level. And when I teach my students in Europe, for example, and I'm showing their work, I think sometimes they're really blown away by the intriguing complexity and paths that are unexpected that are taken in photography. And I think it's a reflection of the creativity that we have to take when access is denied, and also when you're in a more oppressive situation. And I think it's leading to more complex narratives. And I think that those spaces are being reclaimed. And I think photography in general is opening up, especially with the younger generation. I think things are really being questioned.
Tanya, sorry, shall we talk about the unchilding and use this image?
We have 2 more. We have an image. We have this image to discuss because to get Dr. Nadera's perspective. To get, if you're lucky, and that's the thing, all of you have this option for the students that are listening. There are minds that will take you and give you another read and analysis of photography. And this is an image of a house that had already been demolished in Huanich on the outskirts of Jerusalem in Bethlehem. And there's another, it's a very impoverished family. I think there's 13 people living in this very small space. And the house had already been demolished and rebuilt, and they were awaiting demolition. They already had the orders delivered. So every day not knowing when it's coming. And yet this father builds these sort of Sistine chapels. Despite the poverty, there's these little details in the house. And I always loved this image, but it was a quiet image, sort of on the fringe. But when Professor Nadera saw it, she had an analysis that I found fascinating.
Yeah, I think that, yeah, it reminded me of Janine during the incursion in 2002. I went to a family and everything was broken, but I saw on the wall the photo of Haifa, and they are originally from Haifa. So I think that this is also, you see the importance of sticking and historicizing and politicizing when you're putting an image on here. And over here with this one, I actually saw the power of, because this is a house that, as you said, Tanya, is about to be demolished, or there's a demolition order. So you see how for children, you know, the home and school and the community are spaces whereby they can grow safely and powerfully with so much buffer, while the unchilding is hard at work, because the moment you're demolishing the house, or the moment you're attacking the house, and in the settler colony, domicide is the name of the game. It's actually really killing the home as a homeland. And for the child, the home as a homeland is very important. In my latest book, as you know, I offered the concept of unchilding because, you know, whether this photo or other photo, the photo of the astronaut or the photo of the little girl that is laying in somehow like a grave, it's all about perceptions of childhood under the settler colonial machinery of oppression, and the child in that machinery is a political capital in the hands of the state. So unchilding invites us all to examine the political and ethical questions of those children that count. So those children that you have photographed or showed them jumping during the Purim and singing from one side, and from the other side you see the Palestinians being caged. And this is exactly where I saw that this is a mode of showing how the Palestinian is being stripped from their childhood, their ability to maintain a home, while the Israeli settler is there to show that their children are there to be counted because they're the son of God. So this is the sacralization of that group. They are the sacred and the Palestinians are the profane. So the concept of unchilding really invites you to examine the political and ethical question of children that count and the unending mundane really moments of dispossession that we see in the different photos. You beautifully portrayed Tanya, and you managed to bring that message, at least to my eyes, to my mind, and to my heart.
Thank you.
Can you play it? I think you can hear the sound.
I can't hear it. Louder? I can't. Thank you, Samji. And if we could end with a brief description and closing remarks from Professor Nadera on the rock.
Sorry, Tanya, I didn't hear you.
If we could end with a couple of comments from me and then closing comments from Professor Nadera,
sure,
and after questions on the rock.
The rock, yes. So let me come out of here, and give me a second. I will tee that up. There we go. Can you see?
Oh, okay, you're showing it this way. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so there are so many uncounted deaths here, and deaths that aren't even noticed in media, aren't even counted, maybe barely mentioned in local media, and certainly not international media. And this was a death that I never ever would have. I don't do, unless given a specific assignment, hard journalism quite often these days. And I happened to be documenting for a Dutch NGO. The assignment was, what wasn't it? It was a think tank. It was like, is produce being labeled settler produce? And I was just following farming and effects of settler farming in the West Bank. And purely by chance, I was in an area where there happened to be a murdered Palestinian farmer in this very small village that I'd never been to, very remote. And so when I went, it was the day after. And the very I met the son, the 4-year-old son, who was certainly traumatized, and I met, and not understanding really, and I met his best friend who took me to the site, and there was literally blood, just still wet, not because it was winter, and it was wet, and it had dried on the little purple flowers, and it was there in the dirt, and it was there on this rock, and on one you can see a sort of heart shape, and I just kept staring at it, because how do you photograph what's already been taken? How do you photograph what you don't have access to? How do you photograph? And so I photographed, but instinctively in my gut, I was like, these photographs of blood on the dirt, it didn't do it. And so I picked up the rock, and I also was aware of that it wasn't mine. And I said, there's this rock, and I said, do you want it? And he said, no. And he seemed very uninterested. And I took it sort of with the dissatisfaction of, narratively, had I done enough? And I kept that rock in my bedroom, actually, because it's where I store these objects. I talked about being a crow, where I take things. And I was talking to this amazing designer, Zeev Schneider. She's at the Brown Institute in New York. And I was, I learned a lot from her. She's unbelievable. I highly encourage anyone to reach out to her. And I said, oh, you're coming. I said, maybe you could, because she was going to teach me photogrammetry, which is this technique where you take an object and turn it into a 3D. And I said, oh, well, maybe you can take the object, and I'm on my bed, and I go and I reach and I grab it from the closet beside me, and her eyes widened, and she said, you're living with that in your room? And I said, yes. And then I realized, and I thought, it's time to face this. It had been, and so together, and this is one of my favorite parts of the exhibit, because when you're in the exhibit, you actually, it's not a video, you tangibly use your fingers to interact and move the rock around, and it sort of forces this unrecognized death for humans to contend with it. And it became a sort of ritual, of a burial ritual of sorts. And then I did later after that take the rock, and I buried it. I put it into a beautiful location in the sea. But this rock is a mundane object. And again, how do you tell the cruelty of the occupation here? Yes, there's the violent images, but some of it, and the most debilitating, is again, this slow crushing bureaucracy and these, the space where deaths don't matter. And in this case, there was no justice. It happened to be a hiking, settlers were on a hike, the farmer was on the land. There was an argument. He said, why are you on my land? And he was shot dead immediately. Well, he was shot in the chest, and he stumbled and crawled on the various spots of the ground and died. And I followed up recently, and not only had there been no justice, because there's very, I don't have the numbers on the top of my head about the military administration that monitors these sort of things in the West Bank, but his son, not the 4-year-old, but an elder son, was also sitting in jail. So with that, I would love to turn over the final thoughts, and perhaps all of us understanding a little bit more. The thing I love about Professor Nadera, and I've long turned to academia, like Laleh Khalili, different characters, different academics to learn from. But Professor Nadera has an emotive quality and a very visual element to her work. When I read her visually. And so I just think that it would be lovely to end with her thoughts.
Okay. To me, that specific image really brought that power of fathers, that their kids were kept in the Israeli freezers, and Israel refused to release them, and the entire group trying to go to court and ask for the release of the body. The issue of the stone, of the blood, of if counting when it's possible, the bullets and so on are all telling a story. And that narrative that usually is not told of the Palestinian, because even the evidence, as a legal scholar, I can tell you that the collection of evidence and the proving what happened is something that is against the law, is impossible because of the because Israel controls everything. So when I saw that stone, I started thinking about blood and about speaking about that blood, about the ability to speak up, to narrate, and whose narration is there, and whether this can speak and how can it speak. And it's very gendered, it's very gendered when you compare it to what happened to women that are trying to prove that something happened. And it's very hard because there is that power of control. So I guess, over here, the geopolitical is so close to the necropolitics of the settler colonial machinery that is supported globally by powers that are silencing. Even that rock that is speaking blood, it's silencing it.
Thank you. Samji, do you want to
thank you.
Close us out and open it up to the people?
No, but I think that this was very successful in that we are going beyond just talking about like your photo project and your approach by bringing Dr. Nadera in, because I think she's dealing with this on an academic basis with, very thorough research and field work. And I think it was really interesting to get her perspective of how the image is being manipulated or used or weaponized. And also her assertion that photographers need to go and find ways to tell these stories about, as we talked about this yesterday, Dr. Nadera, this idea of like going 20, even 10 kilometers is such a journey, and how do you show that? And I think Tanya has very successfully showed some of these, debilitating circumstances that Palestinians face every day by, the rock, for example, or this, or some of the metaphorical ways that she's, approaching. And I think, that should be a cue to others to kind of employ these strategies and find ways to have these nuanced conversations. So I think it was amazing to kind of have you on this, to give you to have that perspective. I want to open up the floor for questions and answers. For questions for both Tanya and or Dr. Nader, so please keep them coming. But Tanya, I feel like you're on the cusp of saying something, and I kind of interrupted you. So no, okay. So maybe I can kick off the questions. I wanted to ask you, Tanya, specifically about with Occupied Pleasures, and as you moved on to, the Unholy Holy Land, and then A Sacred Space Oddity, you started including the occupiers, right? The Israeli voices, and you had the settlers and rabbis. How was that perceived within your, within the kind of project, but also did you have, an interesting, challenging time in kind of bringing those perspectives, or, and how did you frame that to them when you were talking about, when you were approaching a settler or settler family to photograph them?
Yeah, it actually made things, on the one hand, it's the field work. I actually feel that I have my anthropology hat on more, and it's more challenging. And I feel it rewarding in the sense of when I'm curating and mining and putting the work together, I feel like in my gut that I'm closer to saying what I want to say, in a way that quite often many of us feel dissatisfied when we see our narratives interpreted, whether in an art gallery or whether in media. It also made things much more complicated on multiple ways. One, by having Israeli characters, for example, it made it harder to get funding from certain Arab institutions, right? Depending on the country. And then quite often the edit would be reduced in Western publications. And so while this work is the work I'm most proud of, I feel it's the most complex, and I'm able to access all of the different experiences and voices of my work, anthropological and otherwise, it's been the hardest in some ways to sell. And that's why these grants, like this work was, and actually Occupied Pleasures Magnum Foundation played a groundbreaking role. I had grants from both of these, for both of these projects from Magnum Foundation, but they also brought me to Brown Institute at Columbia, and they connected me. That's how I met Zeev, and who was life-changing working with her, and bringing these complex conversations. And so, it's difficult because at times, you also, it's a complex story. You're meeting, Israeli characters that are beautiful human beings. And some of them, actually, I intentionally sought out sort of liminal characters. Like one of them is a woman rabbi who opens up her mikveh. She owns a mikveh and opens it up and encourages Palestinians to come in and immerse in the water. And so I don't want to make it binary. It's an incredibly complex, and actually, I was at Berton Sellem, who's from the Prince Claus. He does this amazing salon in his house, and he says you can either show a project that's finished or show a project that you're stuck on. And it was the beginning of the project, and I was really stuck and struggling. And I just said, I feel that I'm recreating images that have been recreated of Palestine, and that the Israeli visuals, that they're amazing visuals, they're complex, they're interesting, but I feel that I'm pushing a binary, and I don't know what to do. And am I actually showing that everything is fine under occupation? I was really struggling, and that's the thing, is I really struggle and agonize over everything. And that's where a Moroccan Dutch filmmaker commented, and he said he's the one who pushed me towards this Fellini film, but the name is it'll come to me later. Maybe if anybody wants to know, I'll post it on Instagram. But that film, as well as Robert Altman's Assembly of Characters, Nashville. And in both of these films, there's Fellini-esque scenes where everyone is charming, and it's this little village in the south of Italy, and everything seems fine. And suddenly the surrealist image, they're celebrating at the sea, and then this deep fog comes, and it's obviously it's gone into intense surrealism. And then there's this giant ship, and there's the military fascists on board, and suddenly half of the people on the ship start, the women that were charming Fellini-esque characters, start to and put their hands forward. And I know it sounds simple, but it was sort of like this, okay, I am careful with what I curate, but I'm respectful to all characters. And it's my obligation, I'm doing a disservice to this place if I don't show complex, actualized characters. But to be honest, ironically, showing complex, actualized characters also did limit a lot of the spaces that would take it. Breda, you were the first one to take it, baby.
There's a question, Tanya, directed at you. Can I read it to you?
Please.
It's from Reem, and the question is, thank you for this. I'm curious about the narrative telling process of your photographs, as photography as a medium is so open to interpretation, but you look towards academia to define stories and activate them. In terms of your relationship with subjects, do you do any interviews with the subjects of your photographs when associating a narrative to the exhibited image?
Absolutely. For me, the words, I began as a writer, and I know it sounds crazy, but increasingly I'm a bit bored by pretty images. Like, I think, you know, photographers learn, and they learn about symmetry and how to take an interesting image. And so for me, I'm not looking for that. And so I'm actually far more interested in the words. And so, you know, I did a 5-year project on urban refugees, Syrian refugees in Jordan, where I hardly had permission to photograph, but their narratives and the interviews. And so quite often I'm in the field, and my camera, maybe I don't even bring it out on the first, second, third time, but I interview. And depending on what is revealed in the interview, ideally, we synergize together. I might listen and say, you know, when you said this, I felt this, and I see an image like this, but how could we tell this? And then we collaborate together and find a way of visualizing. So it also feels, because, you know, I have worked in conventional journalism, a bit top down, where, you know, for example, the war in Lebanon in 2006, you didn't have a lot of time for these sort of conversations, and you just took what was there, and that's the word, shoot, took. You know, there's a violence sometimes in the language of photography. And so I agonize. My projects take years, and they're sometimes exhausting, and certainly the funding doesn't, that's why I have to supplement it by trying, when I have an NGO assignment or a news assignment, to try to take images back for it. I reference academia, news, unexpected sources, but primarily, and first, it's the ethnographic interviews from the field.
Sorry, Dr. Nader, can I follow up on Reem's question and Tanya's answer to ask you if there is, and humor me for a second, if there is a danger that if we move towards this other extreme of being really interpretive and metaphorical, that perhaps it can, you can dilute the impact of this violence that is inflicted upon Palestinians every day, that, you know, we become fatalistic, like, oh, it's so hopeless that it's absurd. And, you know, is this something that you kind of grapple with or think about?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think that it's, your point is well taken, and I also worry ethically and morally about also visibilizing those that are in their invisible space are safe. So there is an ethical issue. For example, when you're talking to children, my work with children, or my work with mothers of martyrs, or my work with dead bodies in the freezers, whereby sometimes bringing to the forefront the voices of parents, of children, bringing to the forefront the voices of children can not only expose, and expose because we are, you know, surveillance is the name of the game, and surveillance technology is very strong here. And so we have an ethical, really, commitment, number one, to those that we are talking to. And being a Palestinian living in the old city, a person who works and walks with kids from 7 to 8 in the morning and looking at the effect of the 7 and 8 in the morning on them, and then writing it, there are so many stories and voices that are not told because of my fear and my ethical commitment. not to tell the story because it can visibilize those that do not want to be visible. But at the same time, when I'm, for example, talking to kids on Bab al-Amoud on Damascus Gate, and I see them facing the rifles, and I see those rifles as a mode of penetrating. They're about rapeability. They're about showing us that they can do that, and they can penetrate, invade, rape, and so on. My job as a Palestinian, as an indigenous researcher, is to bring it to the forefront. Now, the question is whether I'm successful in doing it, but also the ethical issue that you have raised is always a major issue that have caused so much material to stay in the drawer and never to be published or never to be told or shared. And it aches me, but at the same time, my main commitment is to my people, to the people that I'm studying, and to our story. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And you know, these debates, I know, Tanya, you've always kind of internalize this, or you kind of, you know, interrogate yourself in terms of like the ethics of, you know, what to show, and, you know, co-authoring is something that you've been doing with your subjects. I think we've reached the end of this, and it's been, you know, fascinating for me personally. And, you know, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Can I ask if there's
Sure.
no more questions from the panel?
No, we're good.
I would love to ask a question, thinking of my students who might be watching, and anyone who's, or just photographers. What you said was like a punch in the stomach about the challenge that you said about how you didn't say photographing the wound. I couldn't do justice to it. Can you surmise the sentence, Samji, so I can get to the question? Do you remember how she phrased it? It was amazing.
The question from whom?
No. When Professor Nadera talked about elevating photography and
right.
Do you remember that sentence?
Yeah, I think that if I can recall correctly, it was that, you know, photographers have to find different ways, or have to find creative ways to tell these stories, and to kind of, you know, bring this home about the everyday you know, violence inflicted on Palestinians, and how, you know, and my question to you at the time was, are you seeing? And
no, it was just the way she phrased it. It was, the word wound was in it, but it doesn't matter. It was just, I'm going to go back literally and listen to this whole thing just to pick up that one sentence, because it was a challenge. But I guess my question is, do you see the role of photography? Do you see it as an important addition to the public sphere and space, whether it be political, whether it be academic, whether it be, more importantly, to getting the narrative out? Is it something that you see as important, and how has it played a role in your mind, photography, as it's been conducted so far in Palestine? And lastly, what advice would you give along the lines of what you just said to photographers? Like there were the two who showed their work at the beginning of this. I was really moved by the one with the tissues. What advice do you give to photographers that are going forward and touching on these sort of issues?
Well, as a scholar activist, I can clearly say that you need to name things. We really need to name. And when you take a photograph, for example, of those that Israel is calling in Damascus Gate, the watchtowers. And when I talk to kids and I ask them, and they tell me, well, these are killing boxes. To me, your camera needs to bring that killing boxes to the forefront. Otherwise, you're not doing a job that I want to, because this is speaking the language of those that are not heard, not seen, and this is speaking from the wound. So if you are able to dig there, how, I don't know, I'm not a photographer, you know, but I struggle with the ways of how can I, like my piece on the occupation of the senses. I was really struggling. So it is that aesthetics that was so violent, and that I needed to fight with people, and people were telling me aesthetics is something nice. No, aesthetic is very violent in the hands of those in power, if they want to silence you and to mute you and to use the necropolitical regime. So the question is, how can you help me as an activist, as a therapist, and as a legal scholar to bring that voice of Rima that is telling me that is called a watchtower is a killing box.
Tanya, you are going to answer the question?
No, oh, I'm sorry, I've never had this Q&A pop up.
So I think,
Miranda, that's exactly, it was allow the voice from the womb to speak back. That was what she said. Thank you, Miranda, exactly.
That's it. Well, I think, you know, this brings this wonderful conversation to a close. Before I just say my final remark, I want to say that we'll have a video from the, you know, Arts Institute of Utrecht that will play. But before that, I just wanted to again thank both of you as the sun sets in Jerusalem and the West Bank and Ramallah for Tanya and for Dr. Nader and Tanya respectively. Thank you so much for your time, for being part of this, and for your, you know, for your beautiful minds to like impress upon us, you know, what is a very, very, you know, challenging situation that you guys have been working on. And yeah, and you know, I'm going to leave everyone with this to screenshot if they want to get the contacts for Tanya and for Dr. Nadera. So I'll just put that up and leave that for a quick second. So if people want to get in touch, they're welcome to, and I will just do that. Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you again for a wonderful evening. This talk will be available within, I think, a few hours on the same link. So you're welcome to use and share, and please share with your friends and colleagues, and especially those photographers who are looking for ways to kind of, you know, tell more nuanced stories. Dr. Nadera, shukran kathir, thank you so much. Tanya, come on, thank you so much. And, you know, to all the participants who, you know, joined us tonight, on a weeknight, thank you all for being with us, and you know, have a wonderful evening. And I will let Siska play the video for the University of Utrecht, so we can see what their program is up to. It's a collaboration between Breda and these institutes. And again, thank you very much to all of you.
Shukran, yatik al-afia.
Bye, Samji.
Sinds 1588 leven verschillende culturen al samen en is er in Nederland al sprake van multicultureel Nederland, of toen nog de Republiek der Zeven Verenigde Nederlanden. Ondanks dat voor lange tijd al aanwezig is in ons land, is er nu het gevoel dat er openlijk over gesproken moet worden. We worden gedwongen over onze cultuur en identiteit na te denken. Maar waarom? De manier waarop ik dit portretteer is door een Turkse supermarkt uit mijn dorp Heerdegewaard als onderwerp te gebruiken. Fatih Kendir, de eigenaar van de supermarkt, is een Turkse man die in 1996 naar Nederland emigreerde. Fatih's winkel is als enige in 17 jaar niet failliet gegaan op het plein waar het zich bevindt. Ieder andere winkel is meerdere keren vervangen door een nieuw bedrijf. De Paradijsmarkt, de naam van de supermarkt, heeft zich gevestigd in de kern van Heerdegewaard. Iedereen komt hier om zijn boodschappen in fruit, groenten en kruiden te doen, of komt er gezellig thee drinken en een hapje eten. Een diverse mix aan culturen komt hier dagelijks langs. Die bijeenkomst probeer ik vast te leggen. Wat gebeurt er wanneer ik met mijn camera tussen twee culturen of identiteiten kom te staan? Ik ben erachter gekomen dat ik anderen, maar vooral ook mezelf, confronteer met de identiteit die ik draag. Ik dwing mezelf na te denken over mijn eigen positie binnen dit project. Ik ervaar tijdens het fotograferen de camera als een observerend oog. Het registreert en observeert en functioneert via mij. Ieder object, iedere ruimte waar ik binnenkom wil ik vastleggen. Ik schets een identiteit die binnen de supermarkt leeft. Dit geeft mij de positie waarin ik kan observeren en registreren, maar niet aanwezig kan zijn in dit project. Het gaat hier over het overhandigen van mijn lichamelijkheid aan anderen, zodat zij diezelfde confrontatie aangaan die ik ervaar. Het vastleggen van mijn project doe ik met respect. Ik ben een witte Nederlandse vrouw die cultuurgebonden niet in mijn eigen familie iets met dit onderwerp te maken heeft. Ik speel en werk veel met denotaties en connotaties. Zoals Bart dus zegt, de verwijzingen naar de werkelijkheid en associaties. Ik probeer het werk zo representatief mogelijk te maken en de werkelijkheid hierin vast te leggen. Sinds 2001 worden de immigranten, vluchtelingen en Nederlanders met geïmmigreerde ouders vaak in een specifiek beeld van de media geplaatst. Hun cultuur wordt veelal gezien als een bedreiging door verschillende aanslagen die de afgelopen jaren gebeurd zijn over de wereld, opgeëist door islamitische staten of groeperingen. Het is voor mij belangrijk dat ik de beelden zo waarheidsgetrouw mogelijk maak, omdat ik probeer te laten zien hoe omarmend deze culturen zijn. Terwijl ik dat doe, stuur ik de kijker in mijn beelden. Ik ben tenslotte de persoon die een selectie in beeld maakt en het vertoont. Daarnaast breng ik sommige foto's in scène met de mensen waarmee ik werk. Ik probeer het dicht bij de realiteit te houden en gebeurtenissen over te doen en vast te leggen. De associaties in mijn beelden kunnen ver gaan, vooral in dit project. Er zijn meerdere culturen in verweven die verschillende associaties meegeven. Vanuit een westers perspectief kun je jezelf snel in conflict vinden met de vooroordelen die naar boven komen. Of een vakantie waar je 3 jaar geleden bent geweest. Vanuit een Midden-Oosters perspectief zul je kleding kunnen herkennen, eten herkennen en uiterlijke kenmerken van jezelf terugzien in de geportretteerden. Er bevinden zich meerdere betekenissen in een beeld wat zich doortrekt tot het eindwerk. Ik ben Cerisse de Groot, een afstudeerstudent aan de HKU. En dit is mijn project, de Paradijsmarkt.
Hi, ik ben Rens de Vries, 25 jaar. Ik ben een 4e-jaars fotografiestudent aan de Hogeschool van de Kunsten Utrecht. En ik ga wat vertellen over mijn project Live, Laugh, Love, Potato, wat genomineerd is voor BredaPhoto. Fotografie is voor mij een medium, en eigenlijk meer een gebruiksvoorwerp, een loop, waarmee ik op grote structuren zoals kapitalisme, klimaatverandering of mediacultuur, door middel van fotografie kan ik daarop inzoomen. En door erop in te zoomen kan ik het voor mezelf tastbaar maken en behapbaar. Zodat ik door middel van mijn werk en door middel de kijker mee te nemen in wat ik doe, een discussie kan openen over hetgeen waar ik werk over maak. Live, Laugh, Love, Potato is een visueel onderzoek naar de verschillende mogelijkheden van een aardappel. Het is eigenlijk een project wat begon met een onderzoek naar aardappelenergie en wat het voor mijn fotografie kon betekenen. En eindigde in dat ik een camera heb gebouwd wat gemaakt is van een aardappel. Dat ik een gigantische namaakaardappel heb gemaakt van aardappellijm. En dat ik heb onderzocht wat eigenlijk de aardappel als een begrip voorstelt. En door die verschillende manieren van één gebruiksvoorwerp uitpluizen hoop ik de kijker te laten heroverwegen hoe we omgaan met dagelijkse objecten. Wat mij getriggerd heeft om dit project te maken was allereerst uit de nieuwsgierigheid van kan dit? Kan ik mijn fotografische apparatuur laten werken op aardappelenergie? En toen ik daarmee begonnen was en er verder op ingelezen had, kwam ik erachter dat 2 wetenschappers van de Universiteit van Jeruzalem hier eigenlijk al mee bezig waren om dit soort energie te verstrekken aan gebieden waar de infrastructuur voor energie niet haalbaar is. En toen ik las dat zij niet gefundeerd werden door de overheid om dit voor te zetten, omdat de aardappel een etenswaar is en niet een gebruiksobject, besloot ik om licht te schijnen op de vele andere mogelijkheden die er al zijn voor een aardappel. Ik zal jullie nu meenemen door de verschillende foto's van Live, Laugh, Love, Potato. De eerste foto die je ziet is eigenlijk het beginpunt. Dat is de werkende aardappelpadderij die mijn handflitser aan doet sturen. Dit was eigenlijk het hele startpunt van dit project. Daarna ben ik eigenlijk gaan experimenteren met wat zou er gebeuren als ik de aardappel laat fungeren als een maker. Dus heb ik van 2 aardappelen een pinhole gemaakt en daar beeld mee gemaakt. En de resultaten zijn deze zwart-wit foto's. De zwart-wit foto's die je ziet zijn ook weer aardappelen die ik gefotografeerd heb, zodat de aardappel en de maker is en het gefotografeerde. De volgende foto's die je ziet gaan over de aardappel als een referentie. Vaak wordt de aardappel gebruikt als een referentie voor iets van lage kwaliteit. Zo, de foto op links is een Nokia-camera, een van de eerste met een digitale camera. En daar heb ik iets hoogwaardigs als de aardappeleters van Van Gogh gefotografeerd om eigenlijk te vieren wat de aardappel heeft betekend binnen in de kunst en binnen onze taal. De volgende foto die je ziet is een aardappel gemaakt van aardappellijm. In heel veel lijmen zoals behanglijm of niet giftige kinderlijm wordt aardappelzetmeel gebruikt als het bindmiddel. Dus vond ik het weer mooi om de aardappel en als maker en als gemaakte terug te laten komen. Het volgende beeld dat je ziet is een poster met aardappelgerechten van over de hele wereld. Ik wilde eigenlijk testen of de aardappel cultureel gezien een bindmiddel is die ons globaal verbindt. Nou zie je hier dus gerechten van elk land van de wereld waar de aardappel de hoofdrolspeler in speelde. En voor mij was dat een bewijsstuk dat de aardappel meer is dan alleen een etensproduct of een etenswaar, maar meer gevierd kan worden als een cultureel bindmiddel binnen de wereld. Als ik zou moeten benoemen voor wie mijn werk bedoeld is, dan zou ik zeggen dat het bedoeld is voor de kritische kijker. Iemand die niet bang is om anders te kijken naar dingen die zo genormaliseerd zijn door tijd of door cultuur of door de maatschappij weer in mijn leven. En durven een discussie aan te gaan over dingen waar we zo gewend aan zijn geraakt.
Hoi, ik ben Pepijn, ik ben een fotograaf uit Utrecht. In mijn werk wil ik eigenlijk de relatie die het natuurlijke en het kunstmatige met elkaar aangaan onderzoeken. En ik zie de camera ook als een tool die van zowel het natuurlijke in de wereld als het kunstmatige in de wereld gebruik maakt. Het project waarmee ik genomineerd ben gaat eigenlijk over de handel in persoonlijke gegevens en de onwetendheid van individuen op dit gebied. Ik kwam bij dit onderwerp uit omdat ik aan het luisteren was naar een podcast die ging over de handel in data en de waarde van data. En daarin werd gezegd dat data sinds 2018 meer waard is dan olie. En dit vond ik een heel interessant gegeven, omdat data niet fysiek is, niet tastbaar is en het is niet zichtbaar. Dus dit vond ik heel interessant. Hoe kan iets wat eigenlijk niet bestaat, in zekere zin, zoveel waarde hebben? Ik begon eigenlijk olie te vergelijken met data en uit die vergelijkingen ontstonden langzaam beelden en daaruit is een project ontstaan. Uiteindelijk is het project een boek geworden, bestaande uit 3 hoofdstukken. De waarde van data, waarin ik dus vergelijkingen maak met natuurlijke grondstoffen, zoals olie. De onwetendheid van individuen op het gebied van handel in persoonlijke gegevens. Eigenlijk zijn wij allemaal een product van Big Tech. We maken allemaal gebruik van diensten van bedrijven via het internet. En zonder dat we het doorhebben betalen we eigenlijk met onszelf voor deze diensten. En dat heb ik eigenlijk verbeeld door overbelichte beelden te gebruiken. En het verzet tegen deze ontwikkelingen. Er zijn ontzettend veel organisaties in Nederland die zich verzetten tegen handel in persoonlijke gegevens. En deze heb ik eigenlijk een podium willen geven door middel van mijn project. Verspreid over het boek zijn onscherpe portretten te vinden van individuen die werkzaam zijn voor onder andere de Piratenpartij, maar ook columnisten die zich inzetten voor internetprivacy. Door middel van dit project wil ik eigenlijk zorgen dat mensen begrijpen dat grote techbedrijven geld verdienen met ons, met elk individu. Jij bent als het ware het product waaraan deze bedrijven geld verdienen. Alles wat jij doet op het internet, wat jij doet op de diensten van deze bedrijven, wordt geanalyseerd en wordt gecommercialiseerd. Hoe meer we dit doorhebben, hoe beter we een gesprek over dit onderwerp kunnen voeren. En daarom is dit boek ook bedoeld als een educatie, als een educatief middel waarmee we meer kunnen leren over deze nieuwe orde, om het maar zo te zeggen. De grootste bedrijven ter wereld op dit moment. En dat we hier in ieder geval op microniveau ook verandering in kunnen brengen en een tegengeluid kunnen bieden. Ik zou dit werk graag willen tonen aan mijn eigen generatie, omdat ik denk dat wij opgegroeid zijn met het internet en bijna niet hebben doorgehad hoe het is veranderd ten opzichte van hoe het internet ooit ontstaan is en wat toen de functie was van het internet. Bedankt voor het luisteren.
Ok, bueno, chao.